A footprint fills with water, not a large one. A child's footprint, pressed into wet volcanic ash, somewhere in what is now Tanzania. It will sit there for over 3 million years before anyone finds it. But look closer. Beside it, another footprint. Not identical. Not the same stride. A second person, walking close enough to touch. 2 sets of footprints, moving in the same direction, at the same time, side by side. That is the entire mystery of this film, compressed into a single moment of mud. Because somewhere, at some point, in some forgotten landscape, a creature that had every biological reason to be alone made a different choice. It stayed close to another. And nothing about human history makes sense until you understand why. Most people assume early humans traveled in groups because groups were obviously safer. Strength in numbers. Common sense. That's not quite what happened. For most of evolutionary history, closeness was a liability, not a comfort. Every additional body nearby meant one more mouth competing for the same berries, the same water, the same shade. In the wider animal kingdom, proximity is usually managed through distance, territory, hierarchy, warning calls that means stay away, not come closer. A solitary animal doesn't share food. It doesn't share water. It doesn't have to negotiate, explain itself, or wait for anyone. So the real question isn't why early humans eventually formed tribes. The real question is why a species built by evolution to compete would ever have chosen, again and again, generation after generation, to stand next to a stranger instead of walking away. Something had to make the risk of closeness smaller than the risk of solitude. And around 2 million years ago, on the shores of a lake in what is now Kenya, we find the first physical trace of an answer. At a site called Kangera, archaeologists uncovered something that seems almost mundane until you sit with the implication. Stone tools. Ordinary stone tools. Except the stone they were made from didn't come from Kangera. Early humans had carried that stone up to 12 kilometers to reach this exact spot. Nearly 7 miles, on foot, through open, exposed terrain where a lone hominin was easy prey. Think about what that means. An early human did not simply pick up a rock and use it where they stood. They planned. They carried a resource across a landscape full of predators toward a place where other members of their group would be. Researchers now believe this sharing of food and resources, hauled from far away and brought back to a common point, helped forge stronger bonds between individuals and gave the group a better chance of surviving. This is not a story about tool-making. Tool-making is old news by this point in the fossil record. This is a story about return. An animal capable of walking away chose, instead, to walk back. And once you see that pattern once, you start noticing it everywhere the evidence survives. 790,000 years ago, on the shore of an ancient lake called Gesher Banat Uakov, something was burning. Not wildfire. Not lightning strikes scattered randomly across dry grass. Archaeologists found flint deformed by controlled fire, and nearby, burned seeds and burned wood, concentrated in specific spots, not scattered across the landscape. More than a dozen separate hearths have now been identified at this single site. A dozen hearths means something specific. It means fire wasn't just a tool. It was a location, a fixed point that bodies moved toward, night after night, instead of scattering into the dark to sleep wherever exhaustion caught them. Most predators do not congregate around a single, dangerously bright, dangerously loud source of light in the middle of open darkness. It draws attention. It announces position. From a pure survival calculus, gathering around fire should have gotten our ancestors killed. Unless the danger of the dark, alone, was worse than the danger of being seen, together. And by this point, early humans had evolved significantly larger brains. Brains that meant infants were born small and helpless, so the skull could still pass through the birth canal, leaving the brain to keep growing for years after birth, through a long, dependent childhood. A long childhood is expensive. It requires food delivered by hands other than your own. It requires protection sustained over years, not days. It requires, in other words, people who do not leave. The hearth wasn't just where they cooked. It was where the species began quietly rewriting the terms of its own survival, trading independence for something evolution rarely rewards, reliance on another mind. Here is where the story stops being about fire and food and becomes something stranger. Because humans didn't just gather. They gathered in a shape. For decades, researchers assumed that early human groups were unstructured, loose, disorganized clusters held together only by proximity, the way a flock of birds happens to fly in the same direction without any of them being in charge. That is not what the data shows. Human social networks, going back through the archaeological and ethnographic record, display something closer to a hierarchical, almost fractal structure, layer inside layer, each one smaller and more intimate than the last. Roughly 5 people you are closest to. Roughly 15 you trust deeply. Roughly 50 you know well. Roughly 150 you could call, in some meaningful sense, your people. That is not a coincidence of modern life. Anthropologists studying the Hadza, a population of hunter-gatherers in Tanzania whose way of life echoes the deep past, found the same architecture hiding in their camps. Hadza social networks carry the same structural fingerprints found in modern digital networks. A small number of people with many connections, strong tendencies to cluster, and friendships that mirror friendships, meaning if 2 people share a friend, they are far more likely to become friends themselves. The unsettling part isn't that ancient humans had social structure. It's that the structure appears to be load-bearing. Remove it, and the whole system of survival collapses with it. Camps that gave generously to the group also received generosity in return, and the pattern held even between people 2 degrees removed from each other, friends of friends who had never spoken. In other words, your willingness to share food could ripple outward to someone you'd never met, because you shared a friend who shared a friend. Kindness, it turns out, was never just a private virtue. It was infrastructure. And infrastructure, once it exists, changes what a species is capable of. There is a moment in the research that should stop you completely. Modern hunter-gatherer societies, the Agda of the Philippines, the Bayaka of the Congo Basin, were fitted with small wireless sensors, tracking who stood near whom, for how long, across entire camps. The assumption going in was simple: blood ties would dominate. Family first. Strangers, at best, tolerated. Instead, researchers found that people typically had 1 to 4 best friends, individuals they interacted with as intensely as their own close kin. And these friendships weren't secondary to survival. The network's efficiency, its actual ability to move information, resources, and support through the group, depended on these outside relationships. Strong bonds with unrelated people were what connected otherwise isolated family units into something larger. Remove the strangers turned friends, and the network doesn't just weaken. Randomizing those non-kin connections in the data collapses the network's efficiency entirely, which means the tribe was never simply an extended family, huddled together by blood. It was something far more deliberate. Even children were found forming bonds outside their own families early in life, a pattern that looks less like accident and more like a built-in human tendency toward connecting beyond the household. Before a child could speak in full sentences, something in them was already reaching outward, already searching for people who did not share their blood, but might, one day, share their fate. That is not a lesson humans learned. That may be a lesson humans were born already knowing. Now the scale widens. Because everything so far has happened inside small groups, small fires, small circles of trust. But around 70,000 years ago, something larger stirred. For hundreds of thousands of years before this point, small groups of early Homo sapiens had drifted out of Africa in scattered, quiet movements, reaching as far as the Levant, the edges of Greece, and each time, the movement stalled, faded, left no lasting trace in the people alive today. Then, one exodus succeeded where all the others had failed. Every person alive today outside of Africa descends from a single successful migration that occurred roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago. The question that should unsettle you is, what was different this time? Researchers studying southern Africa found stone tools crafted in the same distinctive shapes across vastly separated regions, a sign that these populations weren't isolated, but exchanging information with one another. The leading explanation is not better weapons, not a change in climate, not a genetic mutation. It is that social networks, the invisible web of trust, obligation, and shared knowledge, had simply grown strong enough. Not stronger bodies, not sharper tools, stronger bonds. The difference between a wave of humans that vanishes without a trace and a wave that populates an entire planet may not have been written in anyone's muscles or blood. It may have been written in who they trusted enough to walk beside. Fast forward again. 10,000 years. A village called Catalhoyuk, in what is now Turkey. Excavators lower themselves into the earth and find two skeletons, buried together, their skulls resting forehead to forehead. Nearby, the skeleton of a man, cradled in the arms of a woman, exactly as they were laid into the ground. Somebody chose that position. Somebody, thousands of years after these bodies had stopped breathing, decided that even in death, they should not be alone. At another site, Basta, in modern Jordan, 9,000 years old, researchers digging into skeletal remains and studying the population's genetics found something even stranger. The people of Basta were marrying almost exclusively within their own community, despite clear archaeological evidence of active trade and exchange with neighboring groups, and despite a population large enough that outside partners were readily available. This was an isolation forced by geography. The researchers concluded it was a choice, a deliberate cultural decision to keep the circle close. Which means, by 9,000 years ago, humans weren't simply forming bonds out of necessity anymore. They were curating them, choosing who belonged, and just as pointedly, who did not. The same species that once needed every possible ally just to survive the night had learned to be selective about who got to stay close. Connection had become something almost like a border. Here is the part of the story that rarely gets told, because it complicates the warm narrative of humans discovering togetherness. Every act of belonging is also an act of exclusion. Ethnographic studies of small hunting bands, such as the Guayaki of Paraguay, describe groups organized into rival factions, each with its own territory, and each requiring active demographic control to survive, sometimes through practices as severe as infanticide or restrictions on who could have children. Belonging to one group has always meant, implicitly, not belonging to another. The same instinct that drew a solitary ancestor toward a fire, toward a shared meal, toward a hand willing to carry stone 12 kilometers on their behalf. That instinct also drew a line, a boundary, an us, which by definition required them. The tribe that kept you alive was never a boundless circle of universal love. It was a wall with a door, and someone, always, decided who got to walk through it. This is the quiet, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every act of human connection since the very first footprint pressed beside another in the ash. The same mechanism that built trust also built division. You cannot have one completely without laying the groundwork for the other. And this is where the story stops being about the past at all. The layered structure researchers found in ancient hunter-gatherer bands, the 5, the 15, the 50, the 150, is the same structure that governs your phone's contact list right now. You did not invent your closest circle of friends. You inherited the shape of it from creatures who died hundreds of thousands of years before writing existed. And the tendency to form your strongest bonds with people who share no blood with you at all, the instinct researchers now trace back to early childhood, is still active in you. Every time you feel closer to a friend than to a distant cousin, every time you choose who sits beside you at a table, you are not managing modern relationships with modern instincts. You are running an ancient survival architecture, built for a world where the wrong choice of company meant death by morning, in a world that no longer asks that question of you in the same way. The hearth is gone. The predators outside the firelight are gone. But the pull toward the circle of light remains, wired so deep into you that you rarely notice it operating at all. Return, for a moment, to that footprint in the ash. Two sets of prints, walking together, more than 3 million years before either of those creatures could have understood what they were beginning. They didn't know they were finding something. They weren't thinking about tribes or civilizations or the eventual outward spread of an entire species across every continent on Earth. They were only doing what something inside them insisted on doing, staying close. And in that small, unremarkable decision, repeated by countless others at countless fires across hundreds of thousands of years, a lonely, vulnerable animal became something else entirely. Not through strength, not through intelligence alone, through the radical, dangerous, unreasonable act of trusting another creature enough to stay within reach of it. Every relationship you have ever had is a direct descendant of that first decision, which means the real question was never how did the first humans find each other. The real question is whether you have ever stopped to notice that you are still, at this very moment, doing exactly the same thing they did. reaching for the nearest fire, and hoping someone is standing close enough to share it.